Someone gave me a dime. With war in the air, what I wanted was a roll of caps, those little paper bubbles of gunpowder wrapped in a roll for shooting cap guns. 10 cents was a lot to spend on such a thing, but in my mind, I was a tough warrior and I was going to blow something up. The box had 10 rolls of caps in it. I put all of them on the ground and dropped the brick on them. They exploded a little, disappointing me. I dropped the brick again and again, each time getting limited results. And I'm thinking, I could have had an ice cream cone.
What about shower caps?
Hector and I were on one of our frequent visits to our grandmother, who we called Memmer because she was French. Their house used to be the Farley Inn, and it had a formal parlor that was closed to people. I did get to look inside once and saw velvet furniture. So Memmer was elsewhere in the house, and we were in the kitchen with Aunt Vivian. She was stirring a glass of her pee after diluting it with water, and she was coaxing us to drink it. I think I tasted a sip, but Hector wouldn't touch it. I asked my mother to teach me how to dance. She was busy as usual, but she took a moment and showed me. To dance, you stand with your arms out to your side and you rock on your feet from one side to the other, back and forth. I practiced faithfully for a little while.
That is not how you dance.
The army taught my father about taking showers instead of sitting in a bathtub, and he loved the idea. He brought this home, rigging up a makeshift shower in the basement of the store. I was playing outside and peeked in the basement window. My father was standing there taking a shower with his penis hanging out. He saw me and hollered at me to get away from the window. But I had seen it, and it was as long as he always bragged it was. There were about a dozen relatives and friends having dinner in our living quarters behind the store. They were loud and happy. Then they heard me scream bloody murder. Only one uncle got up to see what happened. Especially, my father didn't get up. I was playing in the attic, walking on the rafters. I slipped and fell with a leg on each side of a rafter, landing squarely on my balls. I screamed. My uncle rescued me and put me to bed. I was glad that my father hadn't come up to holler at me for making noise. And as things turned out, my balls still worked. The Iceman came to the store every few days. He had a big truck full of blocks of ice about 2 feet square. He had a rubber apron that he wore on his back, and he carried the ice block on his back, holding it over his shoulder with huge tongs. I wondered where he got the ice in the summertime. How did he make ice anyway? My grandmother's ice box had a small door on the back porch. The Iceman would put a block of ice in that little doorway. I never saw where the Iceman put the ice he delivered to us, but he always carried it in through the front door. Uncle Roland had a BB gun, and we went to the dump at the end of Maple Avenue and shot at rats. I don't know if we ever hit one, but I knew I didn't want to. My father was drafted into the army even though he had 2 kids and another on the way. My mother ran the store and post office during the 2 years that he was gone. I escaped 2 years of my father's brutality. He loved the army. He was stationed not far away at Fort Stevens. They made him a technical sergeant and gave him brain work. But he continued to be a bully and tough guy. The store became a real hot spot when my father was discharged. He held crap games every night. It was loud, with shouts of Little Joe. He brought the army home with him. He bought a surplus Quonset hut, and that was what we were going to live in. I remember watching it being slowly towed down the highway. It was huge. They set it up on Maple Avenue across from my grandmother's house. We lived in it for a year. My mother sat us on the sofa, one on each side, and read Black Beauty to us. This is the only tender moment I can recall from my life in the hut, maybe the only time my mother actually found time to do it. The army pulled his rotten teeth and fitted him with dentures. I overheard him tell how he got drunk with his buddies, and how he puked out the window of their car. There went his new dentures. I never saw my father drink. I guess that episode sealed the deal. I remember when my father told my mother that they were both quitting smoking. They just did it and they never smoked again.
Black Beauty. I love that story.
The hut needed water, and I watched as Mr. Booth dug a well with a spade. He was blind. I was amazed that he could do it blind. I chatted with him a little as I watched and watched. The finished job was a perfectly circular hole 4 feet wide and 8 feet deep. I wanted to see how he got out of the hole, but I missed seeing it. My mother must have called me in.
Drink muddy water?
Behind the hut was a large field. Uncle Marcel practiced racing his stock car in that field, carving a dirt race track. It wasn't very smooth, and the car jumped a lot, and something happened to Marcel. He got sick. The doctor said he had polio, since there was a polio epidemic, and posted quarantine signs on the doors. The house was quarantined for about a month before Marcel died. The autopsy showed he died from a blood clot on his brain, apparently from bumping his head in the stock car. The family had been quarantined for nothing. When we went to his showing, his body resting beautifully in a casket, I took a close look at his face. He opened his eyes wide and immediately closed them. They were blue. I was very startled and told my mother about it. She shushed me and dismissed it. My mother took me to visit Aunt Giselle in the hospital. Giselle was skin and bones, dying from diabetes. When I approached, she turned quickly and exclaimed, "George." She was so happy to see me, and I wondered why. She was frightening to look at, but it didn't occur to me that she was dying. My father wore a large gold ring, and he hit us in the head with it rather often. We called it getting bunged. It never knocked us out, but it hurt a lot and we couldn't stop crying. A doctor later told me I had brain damage.
That's not hard to believe.
My mother's father, Desire Bourbeau, sold his Vermont farm and bought the Farley Inn, a house big enough for his huge family. He worked in the paper mill in Irving, and my grandmother, Lydia, was a housewife. One day grandfather showed my father his design for an automatic transmission. No car had one yet. My father was impressed by the invention, but nothing ever came of it, maybe because my grandfather spoke Quebecois. A year before he died of a heart attack at work, he sold the inn. Except for Roland, all of the children were either dead or on their own. He built a house for my grandmother and Roland. I watched his progress. He did everything himself. It was a very nice house, 2 stories and a basement garage with a steep driveway. It was white and had gables. I saw the house again just a few years ago and it still looked new.
My gramps had a long penis too.
From the highway through town, we crossed a bridge over the Millers River and ascended a long, steep driveway to the farmhouse we rented. I'm not sure why we moved. Perhaps my father had to sell the Quonset hut. The kitchen had a big cast iron wood-burning stove, and next to it was the wood box. The living room had a pot-bellied cast iron stove for heat. Upstairs were our bedrooms. I was responsible for chopping down trees to fill the wood box every day. I remember turning 9 years old and a man walked by. We chatted. I told him it was my birthday, and he gave me 9 cents. There was also a big barn which we explored, notwithstanding the fact that we had been forbidden to go in there by our father. The house was on the side of a mountain and was surrounded by woods. It was a marvelous playground for us.
7 cents, huh?
It wasn't an easy life. When the fire died during the bitter winter nights, we froze in bed. We boys were often sick. One morning, my eyes were glued shut with crusty something. My mother applied a warm wet cloth, and then I could see again. There were times when our heads were so congested that we pulled foot-long gelatinous snots from our noses. We thought this was very funny. One morning after a huge snowstorm, I opened the door and faced a wall of snow all the way up. I was supposed to shovel a path to the car, but I had to dig a tunnel instead. We were playing on the ground near the front door when our parents returned. My father saw used condoms on the ground and asked, "What's that?" I answered, "Balloons." Hector said, "Water balloons." We had clearly done wrong, but my father struggled to hold back his chuckling. Until college, first grade was the best schooling I ever had. Then some authorities ruined it by closing the Farley School and sending Miss Moore and all of us to the elementary school in Irving. Now, 6 years old, I sat at a third grade desk, and Miss Moore turned into a robot who stood in front of the class and soberly said things. I felt abandoned and became as much of a non-achiever as my uncle. I ignored learning the multiplication tables, and I still don't know them today. No one ever told me what mathematics was good for. I thought it didn't relate to anything, so why bother learning it? I sat and scribbled on paper, holding my pencil by the eraser and whipping the lead end back and forth to make a gray area. It was mindless and boring. Miss Moore made me stop, so I just held my pencil and daydreamed.
I used to know 6 times 7.
I was thinking about what I did the previous 2 nights and how if my father ever found out he would kill me. Remembering was very exciting, but I was careful not to give myself away. I was in 3rd grade, age 6, living in Irving. Somehow, I went to the Orange Airport, about 11 miles away. I got into a small private plane and started it up. I had to sit on the very edge of the seat to see out the windshield. I taxied and took off, flew around for several minutes, then made a smooth landing. The next night, I went to the airport again and got into a somewhat larger airplane. Again, I took off and flew around. Then, when landing, I was headed into another airplane where several people were disembarking, standing around waiting together. I did manage to avoid a collision, but the close call scared the hell out of me, and I decided I'd better not try that again. These 2 incidents were completely real to me. They really happened. I was so worried about my father finding out that I couldn't really think about them. But what an adventure I'd had. It took me about 2 weeks to calm down and think about the experience. As I walked home from school, it occurred to me that I had no way to get to the airport. And I didn't know a thing about flying airplanes. The thought that it was real but not real disturbed me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was real? Could I have 2 realities? My questions about the nature of reality began then and plagued me almost constantly for decades. I finally read Piaget's work on such childhood experiences and found something of an explanation in it. But reading about it didn't dispel the utter reality of it that stayed with me.
Well, next time take me with you.
My life was filled with bullies. I was small for my age, plus my age was 2 years younger than my classmates. I suppose I was a good target. I was meek, not a fighter at all. I just got beat up and cried. In 3rd grade, the bully was Tuffy Lyman. He was big for his age. He was always on my case, hitting and pushing and hollering things at me. One day, he started bullying me in the restroom. I took out my jackknife, opened it, and pointed it at him. I thought it would scare him, but he charged at me with his fists and beat the hell out of me. When my father looked at me, he asked, "What the hell happened to you?" I said, "Tuffy Lyman beat me up." I always spoke quietly, hesitantly, to my father in case I said something that would get me hit. I figured if I didn't speak too loudly, he would hit me less hard. My father began swearing loudly and said we were going to see Tuffy's father. I came along quietly. At Tuffy's house, his father said, "Your son pulled a knife on my son." My father screamed at me, "You didn't tell me you had a knife." He hadn't asked why Tuffy beat me and I didn't dare to speak. He grabbed me by the collar and pulled me back to the car.
Well, you could have cut him at least once.
My mother made my clothes on a treadle sewing machine. They were fine. She did a good job. But the other guys at school all wore belts, and she made suspenders for me, button suspenders. They embarrassed me so much that I begged my mother for a belt. I was in 3rd grade in Irving. We lived in a ramshackle farmhouse. My father commuted to Greenfield, where he apprenticed as a watchmaker. It was a gentle occupation in stark contrast to the tyrannical bully that my father was. I still wonder what happened in his mind that caused him to switch to such gentle work. As poor as we were, brushing our teeth with salt, because there was no tooth powder, a day soon came when my mother put a belt on me. She had secretly made a pair of pants with belt loops and showed me how to put it on. The surprise overjoyed me. I didn't expect it at all because we were so poor. She must have seriously pushed my father to buy me a belt. My father didn't buy things for the family. He only bought things he wanted. Like cars, especially cars. By the time I got to high school, he had owned 237 cars. When he couldn't make a car payment, he traded cars because the new loan didn't need its first payment for another month, so he could skip a car payment that way. One icy winter night, my father drove home in his Packard, which had a grandfather clock sticking out the back. The driveway was a long hill covered with ice. My brother was now in first grade and I in third. He called us out to help carry the clock into the house. We took one end and he held the other. He screamed at us that if we dropped the clock, he would kill us. So somehow we managed to slowly and carefully get the clock inside, walking on ice. We felt relieved that we didn't drop the clock. Fear of death, though, continued every moment that our father could see us. He was brutal. The clock made a difference in our lives. It rang its mellow gongs every 15 minutes and the song was very peaceful. It tick-tocked quietly all the time. From time to time, my father raised the cylindrical weights that made the clock run. And it was beautiful to look at. My mother sent us out to pick strawberries. We knew what the leaves looked like, and we hunted for the strawberries. We couldn't find any, and after a while we went back down to the house and told our mother. She stopped what she was doing and walked back with us to the strawberries. She moved the leaf aside and said, "See, there's a strawberry." "Where?" we asked. Suddenly, she remembered that her father was colorblind, and exclaimed, "Oh, no. You've got it too. Oh, my boys are colorblind." We had inherited red-green colorblindness from our grandfather. And strawberries are red.
And strawberries are red.
Our farmhouse in Irving filled with relatives for Thanksgiving. My mother wanted me to say grace, so I prepared something to read and put it in the pages of our Bible. When the time came, I opened the Bible and read my handwritten prayer. Uncle Julian complained that I was too young to say grace, but the others had no objection. In fact, I was wearing a hand-me-down suit that Uncle Julian gave me. This was my first taste of acting like a minister. I felt so holy for a minute.
You? Holy?
The farmhouse was on the side of the mountain. There were acres for wandering, and my brother and I explored the woods. We came across some apple trees, so we picked a bunch of them and carried them home to Mother. She made an apple pie with them and we felt we had really helped out. We found a dilapidated farmstead. All that was left of it was the house, and that was a pile of half their wood. It looked too dangerous to enter. My father and a few uncles brought their guns to hunt down the black bear that had been rampaging the area. We were tense with fear and excitement. We waited a long time for them to return, and when they did, they said they had shot the bear. They were very cheerful. We relaxed immediately. Shooting a bear was a good thing.
Really? A real bear?
The farmhouse had a barn and a shed. We weren't permitted to go in either of them, but of course we did when we could. I found a machine in the shed. It had a crank that made the top part spin really fast. I cranked it a lot because it had power. I couldn't imagine what it was used for, separating cream from milk.
But where does the cream go?
The farmhouse had a wood-burning stove in the kitchen and a pot-belly stove in the living room. It was my job to chop wood for both stoves. It wasn't a bad job, especially in summer when we didn't need heat. But in the winter, I had to chop more wood, enough for both cooking and heating, and it was cold out. Swinging an axe was a good way for me to release the hostility I felt toward my father. I chopped him up many times. The Count lived with us. He was a very old German cared for by the state, and my parents received some income from this. He spoke halting English, loved egg noodles, and lived in the rocking chair next to the Ben Franklin stove. We harassed him when our parents were out. One time I sprayed him with my mother's douche bag, and that really pissed him off. He told my father about it, and my father could barely stifle a laugh before he punished us. There was a register above the Ben Franklin stove, a hole in the floor to let the heat get upstairs. It was a simple matter to remove the metal cover and tie socks together into a string and dangle it down the hole and swing it in front of the Count. He would hit at it with his cane and we would laugh. The Count loved butterscotch candies, and we knew he always had a bag of them in his room. We would beg for one, and sometimes he gave us one, but usually not. We never stole one. Once in a while, the Count would get all dressed up and leave the house to go find his girlfriend. People would call the house and say they saw him walking up the highway.
Did he look like Dracula?
The allure of the town library was the volumes called the Book of Knowledge. An elementary level encyclopedia. I wanted to learn magic so I could make my father disappear, and I looked for how to do it. The librarian permitted me to take home one volume at a time, a privilege that made me feel special. I spent evening hours poring through each volume. What they had to say about magic didn't help at all. It was all just tricks. That was disheartening. I wanted real magic, and I was sure that I was only looking in the wrong place for it, that there was real magic somewhere.
Real magic, yes.
I capture an Indian. We were brutalized as children, my brother and I, that taught me to be brutal, most regretfully. We were playing in the yard in front of the farmhouse. I had a long rope, and I told him to play Indian and I would capture him. I wrapped the rope around and around him, from his head to his toes. There was still a lot of rope left over, so I took the ends and walked away with it and stretched it out. I laid down in the grass facing my brother and threatened to pull the rope. His arms were tied to his side and his legs were tied together. He would have fallen on his face. But then I did it. I pulled the rope. He fell on his chin and cut a gash. To this day he has never forgiven me. Why did I do it? I can only think that I considered brutality to be normal, so why not? Do I regret it? Absolutely. That single incident alienated my brother from me.
You mean brutality isn't normal?
Like the Farley store, the farmhouse had a long, steep dirt driveway ending at a bridge that crossed the Millers River. It was a sharp left turn to go on the bridge, which meant that the driveway headed to the river. It was great for sledding in winter, and only the snowbank at the bottom stopped us from plunging into the river.